The emergency beacon cut through the vast emptiness of space like a scream in the night, carrying with it the kind of desperation that makes your soul ache. You know that feeling when you hear someone truly afraid, that primal recognition that something is terribly, catastrophically wrong. That's exactly what hit director Jake Morrison like a freight train as he sat in Earth's deep space monitoring station, surrounded by the gentle hum of computers and the soft glow of 1,000 blinking lights. Jake had been pulling another all-nighter, third this week, if you're counting nursing, what had to be his 15th cup of coffee since midnight. The bitter liquid had long since lost its ability to keep him alert, but old habits die hard, don't they? He was just another guy doing his job, monitoring the cosmic background chatter that most people never even knew existed. Radio waves from distant pulsars, the electromagnetic signatures of solar flares, the occasional piece of space junk falling back to Earth. Standard Tuesday night stuff. Then the signal hit. The first thing that struck him wasn't the alien nature of the transmission hell. Jake had been hoping for something like this his entire career. No, what made his blood turn to ice water was the raw terror in that voice. Even filtered through translation algorithms and distorted by the vast distance of space, the fear was unmistakable. This wasn't some peaceful first contact scenario from the movies. This was a death cry on the dying world of Kepler-4 for to be. Some 400 light-years away, Ambassador Lyra of the Peaceful Collective pressed her four-fingered hand against a communication console that sparked and smoked around her. Her violet blood, yes, violet because, apparently the universe has a sense of irony seeped from fresh wounds across her torso. The elegant robes that had once marked her as a diplomat were now torn and stained, her normally pristine appearance destroyed by hours of running, hiding, and watching her world burn through the transparent aluminum windows of her emergency shelter. She could see the Shadow Fleet's dark ships hanging in the sky like malevolent thunderclouds. Their weapons continued their methodical bombardment, turning centuries of peaceful civilization into ash and memory. The beautiful crystal spires that had once housed their greatest libraries were gone. The healing centers where her people had spent generations perfecting the art of medicine lay in ruins. Even the children's learning gardens, the children's gardens were nothing but crater-marked wasteland. Please, she whispered into the transmitter, her voice breaking with each word. Anyone listening, we are the Peaceful Collective. The Shadow Fleet has destroyed 11 of our worlds. We have no weapons, no armies. We are teachers, healers, artists. She paused, watching another section of her city disappear in a flash of destructive energy. We offer our entire knowledge archive to whoever can help us. This is our final hour. Back on Earth, Jake Morrison was no longer the tired night shift supervisor nursing cold coffee. The moment those words reached his ears, "This is our final hour," something primal kicked in. You know that feeling when you see a car accident about to happen and time seems to slow down? That's exactly what hit him. His hands were already moving before his conscious mind caught up, fingers flying across his control panel with the kind of urgency reserved for genuine emergencies. "Get me Admiral Sarah Chen immediately," Jake barked into his comm unit, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the monitoring station like a blade. The overnight skeleton crew looked up from their stations, suddenly alert. "And wake up, President Williams. Tell him we have a code-red xenological emergency." You might think it's strange that a guy monitoring space signals could wake up the President of the United States. But here's the thing about working in deep space communications. When you hear something that could change the course of human history, people tend to take your calls seriously. The protocols Jake activated hadn't been used since the system was installed 15 years ago. Most people figured they never would be. The transmission was bounced through encrypted channels, routed through NORAD, and delivered to the White House Situation Room faster than you could order a pizza in downtown DC within minutes, not hours, not days, but actual minutes. The most powerful people in the world were listening to an alien species. Death Cry. President Williams sat at the head of the polished oak table, his usually perfect hair disheveled from being pulled out of bed at 3 in the morning. Around him, the emergency council was still arriving, some in hastily thrown-in suits, others in casual clothes that screamed, "I was having a normal Tuesday night until 10 minutes ago." Defense Secretary Martinez looked like she'd literally run from her Georgetown townhouse, her jogging shoes a stark contrast to her formal blazer. But here's the thing about crisis moments: they strip away all the political theater and reveal who people really are underneath. As Lyra's voice filled that room, crackling with static and heavy with despair, every person present felt something shift inside them. This wasn't about foreign policy or strategic interests or any of the usual calculations that drove government decisions. "How long do they have?" President Williams asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. You could hear a pin drop in that room as they waited for the answer. Communications. Officer Lisa Rodriguez, a woman who had spent her entire career analyzing signal degradation and transmission delays, looked up from her tablet with the kind of expression you never want to see on a technical expert's face. "Sir, based on the signal degradation and the background interference from what appears to be ongoing bombardment, maybe 6 hours. 6 hours. Think about that for a moment. 6 hours to save an entire civilization. 6 hours before another species, teachers, healers, artists who had never known war would be wiped from existence. 6 hours before the universe became a little bit darker, a little bit emptier." The president stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the sudden silence, his jaw clenched with the kind of determination that had gotten him elected in the first place. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority that could move mountains or, in this case, entire fleets. "Gentlemen, ladies, prepare for immediate deployment. Full military response." Those words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Full military response. Not a diplomatic mission. Not a rescue operation. Not a carefully measured response designed to test the waters of interstellar politics. The President of the United States had just authorized the full might of humanity's military to be unleashed on behalf of people they'd never met, fighting enemies they'd never seen, in a conflict that wasn't technically their business. But here's what nobody in that room realized as they scrambled to implement orders that would reshape the galaxy. They had just signed the Shadow Fleet's death warrant. The aliens who had spent generations conquering peaceful worlds, who had grown fat and lazy on easy victories against defenseless civilizations, had finally made a critical error. They had hurt someone within range of human hearing, and humans, as the Shadow Fleet was about to learn in the most brutal way possible, don't respond proportionally to injustice. They respond absolutely. The die was cast. The machinery of war was awakening. And 400 light-years away, Ambassador Lyra had no idea that her desperate plea for help was about to bring down upon her enemies a force more terrible and magnificent than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The question wasn't whether help was coming. The question was whether the Shadow Fleet would survive the experience of learning what happens when you make humanity angry. The screaming started at exactly 0347 hours, ship time. Admiral Mike Thompson bolted upright in his narrow bunk aboard the USS Vengeance, his seasoned military instincts kicking in before his brain fully processed what was happening. You know? That moment when you're jolted awake by your smoke detector, and you're not sure if it's a real fire or just burnt toast. This wasn't like that. Every fiber of Thompson's being recognized the sound of genuine emergency, the kind that meant people were about to die unless someone did something about it fast. The klaxons weren't just making noise. They were shrieking with the urgency of a fire alarm in a crowded theater. Red alert lights strobed through the corridors of the massive dreadnought, bathing everything in that ominous crimson glow that every military person learns to associate with your peaceful evening just got cancelled. Thompson was already pulling on his uniform as he sprinted down the corridor, his bare feet slapping against the cold metal deck plating. 43 years old, 25 years of military service, and he could still move like a man half his age when duty called. The bridge of the Vengeance was controlled chaos when Thompson burst through the doors. His crew the best damn space. Sailors in the fleet, if he did say so himself, were bent over their stations with the kind of focused intensity that meant something big was happening. Really big. The kind of big that changes history. Status report. Thompson shouted over the ambient noise of a ship preparing for war. The bridge fell silent, except for the steady beeping of various systems coming online. Lieutenant Emma Davis, his communications officer and the daughter he'd never had, looked up from her console with eyes that held equal parts excitement and terror. Her hands were actually shaking as she gripped her headset. "Sir, we have orders from command. Flash priority, direct from the President. Alien species under attack. We're going in hot." Now, you have to understand something about career military officers like Thompson. They spend their entire lives preparing for the moment when their government points them at an enemy and says, "Go handle that." But this was different. This wasn't about territory or resources or any of the usual reasons nations go to war. This was about something far more fundamental. Thompson's weathered hands took the deployment. Orders with the kind of reverence most people reserve for sacred texts. As his eyes scanned the document, they widened with something approaching disbelief. This wasn't just his ship getting orders. Hell, this wasn't even just his battle group. The entire 7th Fleet was being deployed. 12 aircraft carriers, cities of death and destruction. 40 destroyers each, one capable of reducing a small planet to rubble. Support vessels, supply ships, troop transports, and at the center of it all, humanity's most feared weapon, the experimental kinetic bombardment, platform christened with the appropriately terrifying name, Righteous Fury. Think about that for a moment. The United States military, the most powerful fighting force in human history, was being unleashed, not against some earthly enemy, but on behalf of aliens they'd never met. It was unprecedented. It was insane. It was absolutely, perfectly human. "Sir," called out Weapons Officer Brad Johnson, interrupting Thompson's moment of awe. Johnson was a career Navy man, the kind of guy who could calculate firing solutions in his head while eating breakfast. His voice carried that particular note of excitement that weapons specialists get when they're about to do what they were born for. "We're receiving additional orders. Marine Corps is launching simultaneous ground operations. General Patricia Hayes is leading the assault personally." General Patricia Hayes, even mentioning her name, was enough to make hardened soldiers stand a little straighter. The Iron Lady, they called her. The woman who had led the successful defense of New Tokyo during the Martian Rebellion. The general who had never lost a battle, never left a Marine behind, and never met an enemy she couldn't beat into submission through sheer force of will and superior firepower. At that very moment, 1,500 miles away, at Camp Pendleton, Hayes was standing before 10,000 Marines in full-powered armor. Picture this scene if you can. 10,000 of the most dangerous human beings ever created, each one encased in half a ton of military-grade ceramic and steel, standing in perfect formation on a parade ground that stretched as far as the eye could see. The morning California sun glinted off their armor plating, creating a sea of metallic blue and silver that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so absolutely terrifying. Hayes herself was a study in controlled fury. At 52, she carried herself with the kind of presence that made 4-star generals nervous and enemy commanders wake up in cold sweats. Her weathered face, scarred by shrapnel from a dozen different conflicts, was set in stone as she surveyed her troops. When she spoke, her voice carried across that vast assembly without amplification. Because when General Hayes had something to say, the universe damn well listened. "Marines," she began, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. An innocent species is being slaughtered as we speak. Their crime, being peaceful. Their mistake, asking humanity for help. You could have heard a pin drop in that assembly. 10,000 hardened warriors, men and women, who had seen combat on 3 different worlds, hung on every word, because they understood something that the Shadow Fleet was about to learn the hard way. When you hurt innocent people within range of human hearing, you've just made the worst mistake of your existence. The enemy, Hayes continued, her voice, rising with controlled fury, expects maybe a few supply ships, some advisors. Instead, they're getting the full wrath of the human race. We don't do anything halfway. Marines, lock and load. The roar that erupted from those 10,000 throats wasn't just sound, it was pure, distilled rage given voice. It was the sound of justice, awakening, of humanity's protective instincts being unleashed on an enemy. That had made the fundamental error of assuming all species were as callous as they were. But here's the really terrifying part. The Marines were just the beginning. Across Earth, from the industrial complexes of Detroit to the weapons foundries of Birmingham, factories were switching into emergency production mode. Assembly lines that had been quietly producing consumer goods were being retooled for war production at a pace that would have made World War II production managers weep with envy. The economic might of Earth, a planet of 8 billion, highly motivated humans, was being focused like a laser beam on a single objective: make the Shadow Fleet regret every life choice that had led them to this moment. Workers pulled double shifts without being asked. Engineers worked around the clock designing new weapons specifically for this conflict. Computer programmers wrote, targeting algorithms while surviving on nothing but coffee and righteous anger. The entire human species was mobilizing for war, and they were doing it gladly. You want to know the difference between humans and every other species in the galaxy? When most civilizations go to war, they do it reluctantly, carefully, with measured responses designed to achieve specific political objectives. When humans go to war on behalf of the innocent, they do it with the kind of focused intensity that reshapes star systems. The Shadow Fleet, sitting comfortably in orbit around Kepler 442b and congratulating themselves on another easy conquest, had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. They were about to discover that there's a massive difference between defeating peaceful teachers and artists, and facing a species that considers warfare an art form and practices it with religious devotion. In the depths of space, jump engines were spinning up, weapons were being loaded, and humanity's greatest military minds were planning the kind of operation that would be studied in military academies for the next 1,000 years. The Shadow Fleet had picked a fight with the wrong species, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. And they were about to learn why humans don't believe in proportional response when innocent blood has been spilled. The storm was coming, and it had a human face. Space-time doesn't like being torn apart. When reality gets ripped open like a giant cosmic zipper, it screams a sound that exists somewhere between physics and nightmare. The kind of dimensional shriek that makes even hardened space veterans reach for their lucky charms and mumble half-remembered prayers. 6 hours and 14 minutes after Ambassador Lyra's desperate plea had reached Earth, the fabric of reality above Kepler 442b began to buckle and warp in ways that would have made Einstein weep. The first jump gate erupted in a flash of brilliant white light that temporarily outshone the system's dying star. Then another, then 10 more, then so many that the darkness of space became a strobe light show of dimensional rifts, opening like flowers of pure energy. But these weren't delicate cosmic blooms, these were the birth cries of humanity's wrath, made manifest. Captain Ryan Miller stood on the bridge of the destroyer, USS Intrepid, watching his tactical display with the kind of expression you'd wear if you'd just opened your front door to find the entire Pacific Ocean rushing toward your house. The numbers scrolling across his screen should have been impossible. The Shadow fleet wasn't just big, it was massive beyond comprehension. Thousands of ships, ranging from sleek fighters to massive dreadnoughts that could crack moons in half, swarmed around the dying alien world like a plague of mechanical locusts. Jesus Christ, whispered Navigator Jessica White, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's systems. Jessica was a 20-year Navy veteran who had seen combat in the Outer Rim conflicts, witnessed the bombardment of Titan Base, and never once lost her composure under fire. The fact that she was whispering prayers meant this was something beyond normal military engagement. There's so many of them. You know that moment in a horror movie when the characters realize they're not dealing with one monster, but an entire nest of them? That's exactly what hit the human fleet as their sensors painted the full picture of what they were facing. The Shadow Fleet stretched across local space like a metal cancer, their dark ships absorbing light rather than reflecting it, creating holes in the star field that hurt to look at directly. But here's the thing about humans that the Shadow Fleet was about to learn the hard way. We don't measure our enemies by their numbers, we measure them by the righteousness of our cause. And, brother, when you're fighting for innocent people who asked for help, numbers become just mathematics waiting to be corrected. Contact the peaceful collective, Miller ordered, his voice steady, despite the tactical nightmare unfolding before them. Tell them the cavalry has arrived. Down on the planet's surface, Ambassador Lyra was huddled in what remained of her species. Emergency Command Center, basically a reinforced bunker that had been built as a museum display about primitive military architecture, back when her people thought war was something that happened to other species. Her violet blood had clotted around her wounds, leaving her feeling dizzy and weak. But her four-fingered hands were steady as she operated the communication equipment. When the human transmission came through, crackling with the kind of signal strength that meant serious military hardware, Lyra felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Real, honest-to-goodness hope that maybe, just maybe, her people might survive the night. Human vessels, she said, her voice trembling with gratitude and desperate relief. We are so grateful. Please, evacuate as many of our people as you can. We know you cannot fight such numbers. Admiral Thompson's voice cut through her plea, like a chainsaw through silk. His tone carried the kind of cold authority that made star systems rearrange their politics. The voice of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to turn other people's nightmares into smoking wreckage. Ma'am, with all due respect, you have no idea what humans are capable of when we're angry. All civilian ships, clear the combat zone immediately. We're about to show these Shadow Fleet bastards why you don't mess with the innocent. Now, imagine you're a member of the Shadow Fleet, sitting pretty in your dark ship, congratulating yourself on another easy conquest. You've spent generations terrorizing peaceful civilizations, taking what you want, destroying what you don't need. You've gotten comfortable with the idea that the universe is full of sheep waiting to be sheared. Then suddenly, your sensors start screaming warnings about massive energy signatures appearing out of nowhere. Shadow Fleet. Admiral Vexamore, creature that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a bad attitude and given it delusions of grandeur, was reviewing casualty reports from the planet's surface when his tactical officer started making the kind of sounds that usually preceded very bad news. Sir, the officer chittered in their harsh native language, we're detecting massive displacement signatures. Something's coming through the jump points. Vexamer barely looked up from his reports. Probably some late-arriving refugee ships trying to flee the system. His forces had dealt with that kind of thing before. Few warning shots usually convinced civilian vessels to surrender quietly. How many ships? A dozen? 20? Sir? ... I'm reading over 200 distinct signatures. And they're huge. That got Vexamer's attention. His compound eyes swiveled toward the tactical display, and what he saw there made his exoskeleton go cold. The human fleet wasn't just arriving, it was materializing like the physical manifestation of divine retribution. massive carriers that dwarfed his own flagship, destroyers bristling with more weapons than some species had in their entire military. And at the center of it all, something his computers couldn't even properly classify a weapon platform so advanced that his sensors could barely comprehend what they were looking at. But the Shadow Fleet had numbers, overwhelming numbers. Even if these mysterious ships were advanced, they were outnumbered 15-1. Simple mathematics said this should be an easy victory. That's when the humans taught them that mathematics can be a very flexible concept. The first human strike came without warning, without declaration of war, without any of the formal protocols that civilized species observed before hostilities commenced. The righteous fury humanity's experimental kinetic bombardment platforms simply opened fire. Tungsten rods, each one weighing several tons and accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, tore through Shadow Fleet formations like bullets through tissue paper. The physics were simple and terrifying. When you accelerate that much mass to that kind of velocity, the target doesn't get destroyed so much as it gets converted into its component atoms and spread across several cubic miles of space. Each impact created what could only be described as miniature suns, brilliant flashes of fusion fire as matter achieved energies that existed nowhere else in nature except inside stellar cores. The light was so intense that automated systems across both fleets shut down their visual sensors to prevent permanent damage. Veximer watched in absolute horror as half his fleet simply vanished, not destroyed, not defeated, erased, converted from ships into expanding clouds of superheated plasma that painted the local space in shades of destruction that had no names in any language. What are these creatures? He screamed at his tactical officer, his voice cracking with panic that his species hadn't felt in generations of easy conquests. How do they possess such weapons? 15 light minutes away, on the bridge of the USS Vengeance, Admiral Thompson watched the tactical display with the cold satisfaction of a man who had just delivered the opening move in what was going to be a very short and very decisive chess game. His weathered face showed no emotion except for a slight smile that would have made sharks nervous. "You wanted a war, you son of a bitch," he said quietly, his voice carrying to every member of his bridge crew. "You got one." The Shadow Fleet was about to learn the hardest lesson in galactic politics. When you hurt innocent people, and those people ask humans for help, you don't get a war. You get an extinction event with a human face, and the real fighting hadn't even started yet. 47 minutes. That's how long it takes to grab lunch at your favorite restaurant, watch a couple episodes of your favorite sitcom, or drive across town in rush hour traffic. It's also exactly how long it took humanity to completely annihilate a force that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. You want to know the difference between a battle and an execution? Battles have two sides, fighting. What happened above Kepler 442b was something else entirely. It was a masterclass in applied righteous fury, taught by professors who had spent their entire species history perfecting the art of warfare. The moment General Patricia Hayes stepped into her dropship, the temperature in the hangar seemed to drop 10 degrees. Not because of any environmental controls, but because when the Iron Lady was about to go to war, even the air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Her scarred face was a mask of controlled fury as she checked her sidearm, a custom plasma pistol she'd carried through 3 wars and never once failed to put down anything she aimed it at. "Remember," she growled over the comm system as her dropship screamed through Kepler 442b's atmosphere, her voice carrying to the 1,000 Marines packed into assault ships behind her. These monsters were slaughtering defenseless civilians. No mercy. Behind her, those 1,000 Marines, each one a walking advertisement for why you don't mess with humanity's children's at, in perfect silence. Their faces were hidden behind combat helmets that looked like something from a particularly violent nightmare, all angular ceramics and glowing displays that turned human eyes into the cold gaze of death itself. These weren't just soldiers. They were the end result of centuries of military evolution, genetic enhancement, and really good training programs. The Shadow Fleet ground forces had been expecting maybe a small rescue operation, some lightly armed ships trying to evacuate civilians. You know what they got instead? They got to learn why human mothers tell their children bedtime stories about Marines, and why those stories always end with the bad guys learning important lessons about consequences. The Marines hit the planet's surface like the hammer of an angry god. Staff Sergeant Tom Anderson, a 20-year veteran who had survived the Martian Rebellion, the Outer Rim conflicts, and 3 tours of duty in places where the Geneva Conventions were more like gentle suggestions, watched through his helmet display as Shadow Fleet soldiers scrambled to organize some kind of defense. It would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. These creatures had spent generations beating up on peaceful civilizations. Artists and teachers who had never held weapons in their lives. They'd gotten soft, comfortable with the idea that conquest was easy when your enemies don't fight back. Now they were facing opponents who considered warfare a sacred duty and practiced it with religious devotion. "They're running," shouted Corporal Ashley Martinez, her voice carrying equal parts amazement and bloodthirsty satisfaction. Martinez was a Detroit native who had joined the Marines to escape a life of poverty and discovered she had a natural talent for applied violence. "They're actually running." Anderson watched through his scope as Shadow Fleet soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in every direction, their exoskeletons clattering against the crystalline ruins of what had once been a beautiful alien city. His response was delivered in the kind of deadly calm voice that made enemy commanders wake up screaming from nightmares they couldn't quite remember. "Let them," he said, methodically selecting targets with the patience of a surgeon and the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. "They need to spread the word about what happens when you mess with the innocent." Up in space, the systematic annihilation was proceeding with the kind of terrible efficiency that would be studied in military academies for the next 1,000 years. Captain Ryan Miller, commanding the destroyer USS Intrepid, pursued fleeing Shadow Fleet vessels with the relentless determination of a shark that had tasted blood in the water. Miller was a career Navy man, the kind of officer who could calculate firing solutions while eating breakfast and recite naval regulations from memory. But right now, he wasn't thinking about regulations or proper military protocol. He was thinking about the alien voice they'd heard 6 hours ago, broken and desperate, begging for help that she thought would never come. His weapons officer didn't need to be told twice. The Intrepid's particle cannons spoke with voices of pure energy, each shot perfectly calculated to maximize damage and minimize the target's chances of survival. The humans weren't just fighting, they were demonstrating the difference between warfare as practiced by civilized species and warfare as perfected by a race that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning new and creative ways to kill things that threatened their families. Shadow Fleet Captain Murdoch, watching his formation disintegrate around him like sugar in acid rain, made the kind of desperate transmission that marked the exact moment when overwhelming confidence transforms into pants-sweating terror. "Please," he broadcast on all frequencies, his voice breaking with panic. "We surrender. We'll withdraw immediately." "We didn't know. We never meant to." Admiral Thompson's response came back across the void with all the warmth of interstellar space and twice the mercy. "You had your chance for mercy before you started burning their world. Now you get to learn why humans don't make idle threats." The righteous fury fired again. Murdoch's ship, along with Murdoch himself, and everyone he'd ever known or loved, became a brief flash of fusion fire, and then nothing but expanding atoms drifting through the vacuum. It was the kind of death that was so complete, so absolute, that it redefined what it meant to be erased from existence. You want to know what real terror looks like? It looks like Admiral Vexamer, the creature who had spent his entire career terrorizing peaceful civilizations. Watching his fleet die around him ship by ship while he realized that, for the first time in his life, he was facing opponents who were better at violence than he was. The human ships moved through his formations like wolves through a flock of sheep, their weapons fire precise and devastating. Every shot found its target. Every target died. It wasn't luck or superior numbers. It was the result of a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of warfare, and had finally found an enemy worthy of their full attention. All ships, retreat. Vexamor screamed into his communicator, his voice cracking with the kind of panic that his species hadn't felt since they'd first crawled out of their primordial swamps. Retreat immediately. These humans, they're not warriors, they're demons. But retreat isn't easy when your enemy moves faster than you, shoots straighter than you, and has absolutely no interest in letting you escape to terrorize someone else. The human fleet pursued the fleeing Shadow Fleet vessels with the methodical thoroughness of a countenance balancing a ledger. Except instead of numbers, they were balancing lives, innocent lives that had been snuffed out by creatures who thought might made right. By the time the last human weapon fell silent, the mathematics of the engagement were as clear as they were horrifying. The Shadow Fleet had arrived with over 3,000 ships, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority. They left with 12 battered, damaged vessels limping away into the dark, carrying the survivors of humanity's first formal introduction to galactic politics. Those 12 ships carried more than just survivors, though they carried a message that would spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. There was a new player in the cosmic game, and they didn't play by the old rules. When humans said they were coming to help, they meant it. When they said they were angry, civilizations started updating their wills. The battle, if you could even call it that, was over. But the real war, the war for the soul of the galaxy itself, was just beginning. And somewhere in the wreckage of what had once been the most feared fleet in known space, Ambassador Lyra was about to learn what it meant to have humanity as an ally. The universe had just become a much more dangerous place for anyone who made a living hurting innocent people. 3 days. That's all it took for humanity to completely rewrite the rules of galactic civilization. 3 days to transform a dying world into something that would make urban planners weep with envy. 3 days to turn the phrase human intervention into something that made tyrants across the galaxy check their insurance policies and update their emergency evacuation plans. Ambassador Lyra stood in what had been the smoking ruins of her capital city just 72 hours earlier, watching human engineers work with the kind of focused efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. These weren't just construction crews. They were the physical manifestation of humanity's refusal to accept that anything stays broken if they can fix it. Massive automated construction platforms hovered through the air like mechanical angels, their robotic arms rebuilding her world's infrastructure faster than her own people had originally constructed it. The sound was incredibly a symphony of reconstruction that included the hum of fusion welders, the rhythmic pounding of molecular assemblers, and the constant chatter of human voices coordinating efforts across multiple construction sites simultaneously. But what struck Lyra most wasn't the noise. It was the fact that every single human she could see was smiling, actually smiling while they worked 16-hour shifts in alien atmospheric conditions, rebuilding a civilization they'd never seen before for people they'd just met. You ever wonder what it looks like when an entire species decides that something is their problem to solve? This was it. Humanity had looked at a devastated world and collectively said, "Nope, that's not acceptable," then proceeded to fix it with the kind of stubborn determination that had gotten them off their own planet in the first place. Marine. Colonel Dan Roberts approached through the organized chaos, his powered armor making soft whirry sounds as its servos adjusted to his movements. When he removed his helmet, Lyra was struck by the contradiction of his appearance, a face that had clearly seen more than its share of violence, marked by scars that told stories of battles fought in places most people couldn't pronounce, but eyes that held genuine kindness. "Ma'am," Robert said, his voice carrying the particular blend of respect and authority that career military officers perfected after decades of service. The last of the Shadow Fleet survivors jumped out system. An hour ago. Your world is secure. Lyra stared at him with an expression that mixed awe, gratitude, and something approaching existential terror. During her species-long history of peaceful development, they had developed sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding the universe and their place in it. None of those frameworks had prepared her for humanity. Your people, she said, gesturing at the massive reconstruction effort surrounding them, you destroyed them completely. We asked for help, expecting maybe a few advisors, some supplies, perhaps a small defensive force. She paused, looking up at the massive human fleet still orbiting overhead like protective steel angels. Instead, you brought... She couldn't finish the sentence. How do you describe the arrival of a species that treats total war as a starting point for negotiations? How do you explain to your own people that their desperate plea for help had summoned beings who considered the complete annihilation of your enemies to be basic customer service? Colonel Roberts smiled grimly, the expression of a man who had heard similar comments from grateful civilians on a dozen different worlds. Ma'am, you made one mistake. You asked humans for help. We don't do anything halfway. When someone hurts innocent people, we don't send strongly worded letters or file diplomatic protests. We send Marines. He gestured toward a group of his soldiers who were helping Lyra's people evacuate survivors from a partially collapsed medical facility. These weren't the brutal, faceless warriors that the Shadow Fleet had faced in combat. These were the same Marines, but now they were gently carrying injured civilians, sharing their emergency rations with hungry alien children, and teaching Lyra's people how to operate human medical equipment. The duality was staggering. 47 minutes to completely destroy the most feared military force in the galaxy. Then, immediate transition to humanitarian relief efforts that would have impressed professional disaster response teams. It was like watching angels of death transform into angels of mercy without missing a beat. President Williams arrived on the next transport, because apparently when America commits to something, they commit all the way up to the commander-in-chief personally showing up to make sure the job gets done right. Williams walked through the rebuilt alien city with the kind of easy confidence that comes from leading a species that has never met a problem they couldn't solve through the judicious application of overwhelming force and stubborn determination, as he toured the reconstruction efforts alongside Ambassador Lyra. She finally asked the question that had been haunting her since the first human ship had materialized above her dying world. Why? The word came out barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of civilizations. Why did you risk so much for strangers? Your people could have been killed. Your ships could have been destroyed. You had no obligation to us, no treaty, no alliance. Why would you endanger yourselves for people you'd never met? President Williams stopped walking, his eyes taking on that distant look that politicians get when they're about to say something that will be quoted in history books for the next 1,000 years. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who spoke for 8 billion humans, but also the warmth of someone explaining something fundamental about the human condition. Because, Ambassador, that's what humans do. We can't stand by and watch innocents suffer. It's not in our nature, not built into our DNA, not part of our programming. He gestured at the reconstruction efforts surrounding them. You called for help, and every human who heard that call felt your pain, as if it were their own. When we heard your voice, broken and desperate, begging for help that you thought would never come, we didn't see aliens asking for assistance. We saw people thinking, feeling, suffering people who needed help. He paused, watching a group of human engineers teaching Lyra's people how to operate advanced atmospheric processors. The cost didn't matter. The risk didn't matter. The fact that we'd never met you didn't matter. What mattered was that innocent people were dying, and we had the power to stop it. Across the galaxy, the 12 surviving Shadow Fleet vessels, limped through jump space, carrying more than just battle-damaged hulls and traumatized crews. They carried a story that would spread faster than their ships could travel, transmitted through quantum communication networks, whispered in space bars, and coded into the emergency protocols of every military force in known space. The story was simple, terrifying, and absolutely true. Never attack the innocent when humans might hear their cries for help. Their response won't be proportional, won't be measured, won't be the kind of limited engagement that civilized species conduct. It will be absolute, overwhelming, and final. The Shadow Fleet had learned this lesson the hard way, watching 3,000 ships become expanding clouds of superheated plasma in 47 minutes of precision violence. Now they huddled in hidden bases and forgotten star systems. No longer the galaxy's premier predators, but just another species trying to avoid attracting human attention. The peaceful collective, meanwhile, thrived under human protection. Their vast knowledge archives were shared freely with their new allies, while human military technology ensured that no one would ever again mistake their peaceful nature for weakness. It was a partnership that would reshape galactic politics, the marriage of wisdom and strength, knowledge and power, creating something greater than either species could achieve alone. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, every tyrant, every warlord, every species that made their living from the suffering of others updated their threat assessments and realized that the universe had fundamentally changed. There was a new sheriff in the cosmic town, and they didn't believe in warning shots. They had asked humans for help. Humanity's response was overkill, and the universe, at least the part of it inhabited by decent, peaceful beings, was infinitely better for it. The end.